The drive from Birmingham to Shelby County took Walter Gaines exactly 2 hours and 19 minutes. He knew the time not because he had checked his phone, but because he had been counting the mile markers, the way he used to count line items in a quarterly budget review. 34 years of running Gaines Cornerstone Holdings, a private real estate development and community investment firm headquartered in downtown Birmingham, Alabama, had trained his mind to measure everything: distance, time, the weight of a silence, the precise moment a conversation shifted from negotiation to something else entirely. He drove a 1999 Ford F-150 with rust along the wheel wells and a driver's side mirror held in place by a strip of electrical tape. He wore a gray canvas jacket, dark work pants, and a pair of boots he had race-oiled twice. He had not shaved since Thursday. It was now Sunday morning. He looked like a man who had nowhere particular to be. That was the point. Walter Gaines had learned something early in his career that most people spend their entire life. The version of yourself that people see when they think you matter is almost never the truest version of how they will treat you. The truest version comes out when they think you do not. He had built his entire management philosophy around that observation. He hired people by watching how they treated the receptionist, not how they performed in the interview. He evaluated partners by showing up unannounced in old clothes and listening to what they said before they knew who he was. He was 62 years old. He had handed the keys of Cornerstone Holdings to his daughter Simone 14 months ago and walked away from the corner office on the 11th floor without looking back. He had been looking forward ever since. His son Marcus had called him 4 days ago. Marcus was 27, the younger of his 2 children, and he had his mother's voice, warm and measured, but underneath it on this particular call was something tighter, something that had been sitting on his chest for a while before he picked up the phone. "Dad, I need you to come up to the property. There is a situation I cannot resolve over the phone." Marcus had purchased 58 acres of land in Shelby County, Alabama 8 months ago. The land sat along a creek bottom with good drainage and a southern exposure that made it ideal for what Marcus had in mind. He had spent 2 years after graduating from Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical University, working on a regenerative farming project in Mississippi before deciding he was ready to build his own operation. The plan was a working farm with a community-supported agriculture program and, eventually, a weekend education program for young people from Birmingham's South Side neighborhoods. He had named it Creekstone Farm. Walter had driven up twice during the early clearing work. He had walked the land with his son both times, asked practical questions about soil composition and water access and the timeline for the first planting season, and driven home without saying much. But what he carried home both times was something he had no precise word for, something between pride and relief. The relief of watching a young man build something real with his own hands and his own vision and not need his father to do it for him. He turned off the county highway onto a dirt road and followed it for 1.8 miles before the entrance to Creekstone Farm came into view. A simple wooden gate with the farm name rooted into a cedar plank above it. Beyond the gate, the land opened into a wide, gentle slope leading down toward the creek. A new pole barn stood to the left, its metal roof catching the morning light. The farmhouse was small and practical. White painted cinder block with a covered porch running the full length of the front. For raised planting beds sat in a neat row along the south wall. Marcus was on the porch when Walter pulled up. He came down the steps and the 2 men shook hands and then embraced briefly, the way they always did, quickly and without ceremony, as if the feeling behind it did not require performance. "You look like you have not slept," Walter said. 2 nights, Marcus said, "maybe 3. Tell me what happened." Marcus looked east, toward the far boundary of the property. He exhaled slowly. "Walk with me." They walked the eastern fence line in the early morning quiet. The grass was heavy with dew. A mockingbird was working through its full repertoire somewhere in the tree line. Marcus stopped at a section of new wire fencing and pointed to the corner post. "I had the property surveyed again 3 weeks ago," he said. "Different company from the first one. Garrett Survey and Mapping out of Column Vision. State licensed, been operating for 31 years. Both surveys put the boundary line in exactly the same place. This fence is on my land. Not close to the line. On my land with room to spare. Someone is saying otherwise. The woman who owns the property to the east. Her name is Patricia Stowe. She moved onto that land about a year ago. Her husband passed away 2 years before that. For the first few months she was here, she was fine. Polite enough. Then I started the second phase of clearing and she started coming to the fence line and telling my crew they were on her property. I pulled the survey. I showed it to her. She said the survey was wrong. Walter walked slowly, his eyes moving along the fence line. What happened after you showed her the survey? Marcus was quiet for a moment. He picked up a small stone from the ground and turned it over in his fingers. She came to my gate on a Tuesday morning about 6 weeks ago. She had a man with her I did not recognize. She told me the survey company I used had a history of errors in this county and that she was going to have the county correct the record. I told her the correct process was to file a formal boundary dispute with the county assessor's office and that I had no objection to that process. She looked at me for a long time without saying anything, and then she said something that I keep hearing in my head every time I try to sleep. What did she say? Marcus set the stone down carefully on top of the fence post. She said, "Young man, my husband was Sheriff Douglas Stowe. He served Shelby County for 23 years. He built the relationships that hold this county together. Every deputy in that department, every clerk in every county office, every judge who sits on that bench, they all knew Douglas Stowe. Some of them owe him things they have not finished paying back. I pick up the phone and your permits get complicated. I pick up the phone again and your financing gets a second look. You are a young man from Birmingham who bought some acreage and thinks he understands how things work out here. You do not. Go back to the city and let this go." The mockingbird had gone quiet. The morning felt very still. "And then," Walter said, "she left. For days later, my grading permit for the second phase of the education building was placed under administrative review by the county engineering office. No written explanation, no timeline given. The review could run anywhere from 45 to 120 days. I have a contractor lined up, materials ordered, and a program scheduled that depends on that building being ready by April. I have families signed up, Dad. Real families. A woman named Denise who drives her auto 40 minutes each way to a community garden program in Hoover because there is nothing closer. She signed up for this because it would be 10 minutes from her house." Walter looked at his son. He looked at the fence line. He looked at the pole barn and the farmhouse and the raised beds along the south wall. He thought about a woman named Denise driving 40 minutes each way so her daughter could put her hands in the soil. "Is Patricia Stowe home this morning?" he asked. "Her car was there when I drove past the access road at 7:30. "All right," Walter said. "Go make some coffee. I am going to go introduce myself." Marcus grabbed his arm. "Dad, she is not someone who responds to reason. She has been using Douglas Stowe's name in this county for 2 years and it has worked every time. The people she calls, they answer. They do things. I understand that. I can call our attorney right now. We can file everything today and let the legal process handle it." "We will do that," Walter said. "But let me go talk to her first. By myself." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he released his arm. Walter went to the truck. He reached into the canvas bag on the passenger seat and took out a small notebook, the kind with a brown cardboard cover that he had been buying from the same office supply store in Birmingham for 20 years. He put it in his jacket pocket with a pen. Then he drove out of Creekstone Farm and turned east on the dirt road. Patricia Stowe's property was 44 acres of mixed pasture and hardwood. The house was a large brick ranch style with white trim and a 3-car garage. The kind of house that had been built to last and maintained to impress. At the entrance, a pair of stone columns flanked a paved driveway. On the left column, mounted at eye level, was a bronze plaque. Walter stopped the truck and got out to read it. "In memory of Sheriff Douglas R. Stowe, Shelby County Sheriff's Department. 23 years of dedicated service. A man who kept his word." Walter stood there for a moment, reading it twice. Then he walked up the driveway. Patricia Stowe appeared on the front steps before he reached them. She was in her late 50s, trim and composed, with short silver hair and the kind of stillness that comes from years of standing beside a man who never had to raise his voice to be heard. She wore a cream-colored blouse and dark slacks on a Sunday morning. She looked at Walter the way people look at a stranger who has arrived without an appointment and therefore without standing. "This is private property," she said. "Good morning, ma'am." Walter kept his voice easy and unhurried. "My name is Walter. I am Marcus's father. I drove up from Birmingham this morning to visit my son, and I was hoping to have a few minutes of your time to talk about the boundary question, if that is all right with you." She looked at the old Ford at the end of her driveway. She looked at the canvas jacket and the unshaved face in the boots with the race-old soles. She did not move from the steps. "There is no boundary question," she said. "There is a boundary error that your son refuses to correct. The survey he is relying on is not reliable. I have already been in contact with the county assessor's office." "I understand," Walter said. "The survey Marcus used was conducted by Garrett's Survey and Mapping out of Vision. They have been licensed by the state of Alabama for 31 years, and they have no record of disputed findings in this county. The boundary they confirmed is consistent with the original deed in every measurement." "Surveys can be wrong," Patricia said. "Original deeds can contain errors. What cannot be wrong is the history of this land and the people who have worked it." "How long has your family owned this property?" Walter asked. A pause, brief but real. "I purchased it 3 years ago," she said, "after my husband passed." "I am sorry for your loss," Walter said. Patricia Stowe's posture shifted slightly, not softening, recalibrated. "Douglas gave 23 years to this county," she said. "He knew every road and every family and every piece of land in Shelby County. He was not just a sheriff. He was the reason this county functioned the way it did. When I express a concern about what is being built on the property next to my home, people in this county take that seriously. They took it seriously when he was alive, and they take it seriously now. That is not something that disappears when a man dies." "I respect that," Walter said. "Public service at that level deserves respect, but I want to make sure I understand your concern correctly. Is the boundary line the actual issue, or is there something about the nature of my son's project that concerns you?" The question was quiet. It was also precise. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. "The boundary line is the issue. Then the formal dispute process through the county assessor is the right path," Walter said. "Marcus has no objection to that process. What he does object to is the idea that administrative permits might be affected by phone calls rather than by the legal merits of his application." Patricia Stowe came down one step. "I want to be clear with you," she said, and her voice had dropped into something harder and more deliberate. "I have lived in this county for 3 years. In that time I have been to the home of every county commissioner for dinner. I attended the dedication of the new wing of the Shelby County Courthouse that bears my husband's name. I have a standing relationship with the presiding judge of the circuit court and with the director of the county engineering office. Douglas built those relationships over 23 years, and they did not end with him. When I make a phone call, it gets answered. When I express a concern, it gets addressed. That is not a boast. That is simply how things work in a county where people remember what they owe." Walter opened his notebook. He uncapped his pen. "Do you mind if I take a few notes?" he asked pleasantly. "I find I remember conversations more accurately when I write things down." Patricia's toe went very still. "What are you writing?" "Just what you said. That you have relationships with the county commissioners, the presiding circuit court judge, and the director of the county engineering office. And that those relationships influence how concerns you raise get addressed. I want to make sure I have that right." The pen hovered over the notebook. The morning was absolutely quiet. "Who are you?" she said. "I told you. I am Marcus's father. I drove up from Birmingham this morning." "What do you do in Birmingham?" "I am retired," Walter said simply. She studied him for a long moment. The old truck, the worn jacket, the notebook. "I think this conversation is finished," she said. "I suggest your son hire a local attorney and pursue the proper channels. And I suggest you go back to Birmingham." "I appreciate your time," Walter said. He capped the pen, closed the notebook, and nodded once. "Have a good morning, Mrs. Stowe." He walked back down the driveway, got in the Ford, and drove back to Creekstone Farm. Now pay close attention, because what happens next is the part of this story that most people never see. And it is the part that matters most. Marcus was on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Walter without speaking. They sat in the wooden chairs and looked out at the farm for a while. A pair of crows were working the edge of the pole barn roof, methodical and unhurried. "How did it go?" Marcus finally asked. "She is exactly what you described," Walter said. "She has been using that name for 2 years and it has worked every time, and she has no reason to believe this time will be any different. She is not cruel in the way that people who enjoy cruelty are cruel. She is cruel in the way that people who have never faced consequences are cruel. She does not even know she is doing it. So what do we do?" Walter drank his coffee. He looked at the raised beds along the south wall, at the neat rows of winter cover crop coming up green in the morning light. "For things," he said. Marcus waited. "First, we call Adrienne Holloway at the firm. She handles property and land you saw, and she's the best in Birmingham at what she does. We file a formal boundary confirmation with the Shelby County assessor today. Written, documented, certified. We create a paper record of every interaction we have had with Patricia Stowe and every administrative action that has followed her complaints." Marcus nodded. "Second, we send a certified letter to the county engineering office requesting a written explanation, specific and legally grounded, for the administrative review of your grading permit. Not a phone call, a letter that requires a written response. People who use informal pressure to create bureaucratic delays almost never want to put their reasoning in writing. The moment you require them to do that, the pressure usually stops." "What is the third thing?" Walter set down his coffee mug. "I am going to call Franklin say at the Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industries. Franklin runs the Sustainable Agriculture Development Program. I served on his program advisory committee for 7 years. Your operation at Creekstone is exactly the kind of project his office supports and promotes. If this farm has a formal relationship with a state agency, the informal leverage of a county widow working her late husband's contacts becomes significantly weaker." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You served on the advisory committee of the Alabama Department of Agriculture for 7 years," Walter said. "And you know the program director personally." "Franklin came to your mother's funeral," Walter said simply. He sat in the third row. Marcus looked at his father, the old truck in the driveway, the canvas jacket, the 5 days of stubble, the notebook in the jacket pocket. "Dad, who exactly did Patricia Stowe just try to run off her property?" Walter looked out at the farm. The crows had moved on. The morning was bright and still and full of the smell of turned earth. "A retired man in an old truck," he said. That is all she needed to know. And here is what Patricia Stowe did not understand about the man she had just dismissed from her front steps. She did not understand it because he had given her no reason to understand it. He had arrived in a vehicle worth less than her monthly property tax payment. He had worn clothes that suggested a man of modest means and modest ambitions. He had spoken quietly unwritten in a small brown notebook and said nothing that would have indicated to any reasonable observer that he was anything other than what he appeared to be. What he was this. Walter Gaines had founded Cornerstone Holdings in a two-room office on 4th Avenue, Worth in Birmingham in 1989 with $42,000 in savings and a single commercial property contract. Over the following 34 years, he had grown that company into a firm managing a portfolio of $217 million in real estate assets across 6 southeastern states. He had served on the boards of 3 Alabama universities. He had been appointed to 2 consecutive terms on the advisory committee of the Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industry. He had been a guest at the governor's residence on 6 separate occasions. He had endowed a scholarship fund at Alabama I&M that had put 63 students through 4-year degrees in agricultural science over the past 11 years. He had never put any of that on a business card he carried in his canvas jacket. Patricia Stowe made her calls that same afternoon. The first call was to a man named Deputy Sheriff Carl Briggs, who had served under Douglas Stowe for 14 years and who had been to the Stowe house for Christmas dinner 4 times and who understood, without Patricia needing to explain it in detail, what was expected of him when she called. She told him there was a situation at the farm property to the west. A man from Birmingham had come to her home uninvited that morning and had been writing things down in a notebook while she spoke. She used the word aggressive. She used the phrase, "I felt threatened in my own home." She mentioned Douglas's name once at the beginning of the call and once at the end. Deputy Briggs arrived at Creekstone Farm at 2:43 in the afternoon. Walter and Marcus were in the pole barn going over the materials list for the education building when they heard the cruiser on the gravel. They walked out together into the afternoon light. Briggs was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s who had the practiced ease of someone accustomed to arriving places and having people become immediately cooperative. He stood beside his cruiser with his arms crossed and looked at Walter with an expression that had already reached its conclusion. "Which one of you came to the Stowe property this morning?" he said. "I did," Walter said. "I am going to need you to come with me, sir. We have received a complaint regarding your conduct at that property." Walter did not move. He did not raise his voice or change his expression. He stood with his hands at his sides in the afternoon light and looked at Deputy Briggs with the complete calm of a man who has been in far more difficult rooms than a farm doctorway in Shelby County. "What is the specific nature of the complaint?" he asked. "Sir, I am not going to go back and forth with you on this. You need to come with me right now." Marcus stepped forward. "Deputy, this is private property. My father visited the neighboring property this morning at approximately 9:45 and returned here before 10:30. He has been here since. He has not left this farm. If there is a complaint, I would like to know the specific allegation before anyone goes anywhere." Briggs looked at Marcus the way men like Briggs look at young black men, who speak with precision and do not flinch. It was a look that was calculating rather than angry, deciding how much resistance was worth engaging with. "Son," Briggs said, "I am talking to your father." "He is not going anywhere without knowing the charge," Marcus said. "That is not obstruction. That is a legal right." Briggs reached for his radio, and Walter's phone rang. He looked at the screen. He looked at Marcus. He answered it on speaker without hesitation. The voice on the other end was unhurried and professional. "Walter, it is Franklin. I just finished a call with the Deputy Commissioner's office. They want to include Creekstone Farm in the Spring Rural Development Showcase. I told them you were up there this weekend. They are going to need a formal letter of participation from you by the end of the month. Also, I got a message from the Birmingham Business Journal. They are running a feature on the Cornerstone Holdings Legacy Initiative and they want a quote from you directly. I told them you were taking some personal time, but they said it was time sensitive." Briggs had gone completely still. His hand was on his radio, but he was not pressing anything. "Franklin," Walter said, "I am going to need to call you back in a few minutes. I am in the middle of something." "Everything all right up there?" "Everything is fine," Walter said. "I will call you shortly." He ended the call. He looked at Deputy Briggs. The deputy's arms were no longer crossed. They were at his sides. Something had moved through his face, not remorse. Not yet, but the first real crack in the certainty he had arrived with. The certainty that had been built on 14 years of knowing who Douglas Stowe was and what it meant when Patricia Stowe picked up the phone. Marcus spoke quietly. "The Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industries," he said. "The Birmingham Business Journal. The Cornerstone Holdings Legacy Initiative." He let those words settle in the afternoon air for a moment. "Deputy Briggs," Marcus continued, "my father is Walter Gaines. He founded Cornerstone Holdings in Birmingham 34 years ago. He has served on the advisory committee of the Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industries for 7 years. He has been a guest at the governor's residence 6 times. He drove up here this morning in that truck because that is who he is. And he went to speak with Mrs. Stowe this morning because I asked him to try to resolve an neighbor dispute before we involved attorney." Briggs looked at Walter. He looked at the old Ford F-150. He looked back at Walter. Walter said nothing. He simply waited. He had been waiting in rooms like this his entire life, rooms where someone had decided who he was before he opened his mouth. And he had learned that the most powerful response to that kind of decision was not anger and not a counter-display of credentials. It was patience. Patience so complete and so unhurried that it became its own kind of authority. Briggs cleared his throat. "I apologize for the misunderstanding," he said. His voice had lost its shape. Walter nodded once. "I appreciate you coming out," he said. "Doctor safe, Deputy." Briggs got in his cruiser. He sat there for 9 seconds before he started the engine. Walter counted them. Then the cruiser backed out onto the dirt road and drove away in a thin trail of dust. Marcus stood beside his father and watched it go. "You counted," Marcus said. "I always count," Walter said. "It keeps me calm. But the story does not end in a driveway. The real consequences, the ones that change things, those take longer to arrive. They arrive with paperwork and phone calls and the slow grinding of institutional processes that most people never see and that are, in the end, the only thing that actually works." Adrienne Holloway filed the formal boundary confirmation with the Shelby County Assessor's Office the following morning. The assessor appointed an independent state licensed surveyor to conduct a review. The review took 14 business days. On the 15th day, the assessor's office issued a written determination confirming that the boundary established by Garrett's survey and mapping was accurate and consistent with the recorded deed in every measurement. Patricia Stowe's dispute was formally closed without merit and entered into the permanent county property record. The certified letter to the county engineering office arrived on a Wednesday. It requested a written legal explanation, specific and documented, for the administrative review of the Creekstone Farm grading permit. By the following Friday, the engineering director had called Marcus directly. The administrative review had been completed. The permit was approved. The engineering director did not explain why the review had been initiated. He did not need to. The permit was in hand. What happened to Deputy Carl Briggs was not something Walter engineered. It happened because the truth, once it begins moving through a small county, does not stop at the first door it finds. Within 3 weeks of the incident at Creekstone Farm, separate residents of Shelby County had filed complaints with the sheriff's office describing similar experiences. Briggs arriving at their properties in response to calls from Patricia Stowe. Briggs using his authority to pressure people who had disputes with her. A retired schoolteacher who had been told her fence permit would face complications after a disagreement with Patricia over a shared drainage easement. A young couple who had been visited twice by Briggs after Patricia complained about the noise from their small equipment operation on the adjacent parcel. The pattern was not complicated once someone started looking for it. The Shelby County Sheriff, a careful man named Howard Gentry who had won his last election by a margin of 308 votes and who had no interest in a civil rights complaint, landing on the desk of the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, opened a formal internal affairs review of Briggs's conduct on a Monday morning. Briggs was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review by Thursday afternoon. He did not return to active duty. Adrienne Holloway shared a documented timeline of the permit interference with a contact at the Alabama Attorney General's office 6 weeks after the driveway incident. The documentation was thorough. 12 pages with attachments. It described the sequence of Patricia Stowe's threat, the permit delay, the deputy's visit, and the resolution. It named dates and times unspecific individuals. It was the kind of documentation that makes people in government offices sit very straight in their chairs and reach for their calendars. Patricia Stowe was not charged with a crime. The investigation determined that her actions, while a serious abuse of the social capital she had inherited from her husband's career, did not meet the threshold for criminal prosecution. But the investigation itself, the questions asked of county commissioners and engineering officials and the deputy who had been doing her bidding for 2 years, that was consequence enough of its own kind. Every commissioner who had been taking her calls stopped returning them. The engineering director who had flagged Marcus's permit submitted his resignation 3 months later. And the name Douglas Stowe, which Patricia had been carrying like a passkey for 2 years, stopped opening doors in Shelby County. Not because people stopped respecting the man, but because they had watched what his name had been used for, and that watching had changed something permanent in how they thought about it. Franklin Osei drove up to Creekstone Farm himself on a Tuesday morning 5 weeks after the phone call in the driveway. He walked the land with Marcus for 2.5 hours, asked detailed questions about the curriculum design and the community-supported agriculture model and the long-term sustainability of the education program. He left with a handshake and a commitment to include Creekstone Farm in the department's Rural Development Grant cycle. The grant, approved for months later, provided $186,000 toward the construction and operating costs of the education building. The news of the state agriculture department's involvement moved through Shelby County, the way news moves through small counties. Quietly, completely, and with no possibility of being taken back. 3 county commissioners reached out to Marcus within 2 weeks to express support for the project. The county extension office offered technical assistance for the soil management program. A local hardware cooperative offered a materials discount for the building phase. Patricia Stowe did not call anyone. The Creekstone Farm Education building opened on a Saturday morning in late March. The weather was cool and bright, the kind of Alabama morning that feels like a promise kept. 16 families from Birmingham's South Side arrived in a convoy of personal vehicles and 1 church van. Among them was a woman named Denise, who had driven her daughter 40 minutes each way to a community garden program in Hoover for 2 years because there was nothing closer to home. She stood at the edge of the new building and looked at the raised beds and the tool wall and the calcboard with the season's planting schedule written on it, and she was quiet for a long time. "This is real," she finally said to no one in particular. "This is actually real." Walter drove up from Birmingham the night before the opening. He arrived in the old Ford, parked it beside the pole barn, and sat on the porch with Marcus until late, talking about things that had nothing to do with property lines or building permits or county politics. They talked about Marcus's mother, who had died 4 years ago and who had been the one who first took Marcus to a farm, a small operation in Tuscaloosa run by a man who had gone to school with her father when Marcus was 9 years old. Marcus had spent an entire afternoon that day following the farmer around, asking questions about why certain plants grew next to certain other plants and what the soil smelled like after rain and whether worms felt anything. "I did not understand then what that afternoon was," Walter said. "I think I did," Marcus said. "Even then, the ribbon cutting was simple. A pastor from the neighborhood church said a blessing. Marcus spoke for 5 minutes without notes, standing in front of the building he had built, talking about the families who were there and what he hoped they would carry home with them. Not just knowledge about growing food, though that mattered, but the experience of being somewhere that was made for them. That said, you belong here. That said, your presence on this land is not a question or a condition. It is a fact." Walter stood at the back of the small crowd and listened without speaking. Patricia's toe was standing 12 feet to his right. She had called Marcus 2 weeks before the opening and asked, quietly and without explanation, if she could attend. Marcus had said yes. He had not told his father until the morning of the event. After the ceremony, after the families had moved through the building and the children had been taken out to the planting beds by Marcus's staff members, Patricia walked over to where Walter was standing. She stopped a few feet away. She looked different from the woman on the front steps. The composure was still there, but the certainty underneath it was gone. And without the certainty, the composure looked like what it actually was, which was effort. "I owe you an apology," she said. Walter waited. "What I did, using Douglas's name the way I did, having Carl Briggs come to your son's property, trying to slow down what was being built here." She looked at the building, at the children, at the planting beds. "I told myself it was about the survey, but I knew it was not. I think I knew from the beginning." "What was it about?" Walter asked. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the children at the planting beds. A girl of about 10 was holding a handful of soil up to her face and smelling it with an expression of complete seriousness. "Douglas and I never had children," Patricia said. "We tried for a long time and eventually we stopped trying and we found other things to fill the space. When he died, I came out here because he had always talked about retiring to land like this. I thought being near it would be enough. And then I watched what your son was building and I felt something I had not expected to feel." She stopped. "I was angry," she said. "Not at Marcus. At the distance between what I had and what I had not let myself want. It was easier to make the fence line the problem than to sit with that." Walter looked at her for a long moment. "That is an honest thing to say," he said. "It is a late thing to say." "Late is better than silent," Walter said. They stood together and watched the girl at the planting bed set the handful of soil down carefully and then pick it up again, as if she was trying to decide whether to keep it. Now, here is the part of this story that is easiest to miss. Walter Gaines never told Patricia Stowe who he was. Not on her front steps. Not in the driveway when Briggs was standing there with his hand on his radio. He never used his name as a weapon. He never announced himself. He arrived in an old truck, walked up a long driveway, opened a small brown notebook, and asked precise questions. He let the process do the work that intimidation never can. There is a version of this story where Walter announces himself on those front steps and watches Patricia Stowe's face change in real time, where he uses his name the way she used her husband's name, as a blunt instrument, as a way of establishing who has more standing in this particular moment. That version feels satisfying for about 30 seconds, and then it is just to people who have turned each other into symbols instead of human beings. The version that actually happened was slower and less dramatic and produced something that will outlast both of them. 16 families from Birmingham's South Side now have a place where their children can put their hands in the soil and learn something about where food comes from and what it takes to grow it. Some of those children will go home and forget most of what they learned. Some of them will carry one idea. One morning, one handful of soil held up to the face, and the thing will change the direction of their life in ways that no one can predict and no one can take back. Patricia Stowe, who spent 2 years wielding a dead man's name like a key to doors that were not hers to open, is going to help teach them. She knows this county. She knows this land. She knows things about the soil and the seasons in this part of Alabama that took decades to learn. That knowledge belongs in that building. It does not belong locked behind a bronze plaque on a stone column at the end of a private driveway. And Deputy Carl Briggs, who spent 14 years doing favors for a woman who never once considered what it cost him, sat at home on administrative leave and had a great deal of time to think about the difference between loyalty and complicity. That distinction, once you see it clearly, cannot be unseen. There are a few things worth understanding before you go. This story is fiction. Walter Gaines, Marcus Gaines, Patricia Stowe, Carl Briggs, and Creekstone Farm do not exist. Shelby County, Alabama is a real place with real people who work hard and treat each other well, and the events in this story did not happen there. This story was written to explore patterns of behavior that are real, the use of inherited social capital to apply informal pressure, the way grief can harden into something that hurts other people, the way patience and correct process can outlast intimidation in a way that might be useful to someone watching. Here is what is real. In the United States, property boundary disputes are resolved through a formal process involving licensed surveyors and county assessor offices. That process exists precisely to prevent informal pressure from overriding documented legal rights. If you own property and face a boundary dispute, the correct first step is always an independent licensed survey, followed by a formal filing with your county assessor. Do not try to resolve it in a conversation at a fence line. Create a paper trail. Document every interaction. Ask for everything in writing. The written record is the only thing that cannot be reinterpreted later by someone with more connections than you. The second thing that is real is this. When someone uses institutional relationships to apply informal pressure, the most effective response is almost never a louder counter-threat. It is documentation, correct process, and the quiet accumulation of legitimate relationships that cannot be undone by a single phone call. Walter Gaines did not prevail because he was more powerful than Patricia Stowe. He prevailed because he was more methodical. He prevailed because he had spent 34 years learning that the person who controls the process controls the outcome, and that the process is always available to anyone willing to use it correctly. The third thing is the one that matters most. The most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to make you feel small is to refuse to perform smallness. Not with anger, not with a counter display of status or credentials or connections. Just with the steady, unhurried confidence of a person who knows exactly who they are, exactly what the law says, and exactly what the right next step is. That kind of confidence is not inherited. It is not purchased. It is built, slowly and without shortcuts. from the habit of doing things correctly even when no one important is watching. Especially when no one important is watching. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who is in the middle of a fight they are not sure they can win. Not because it promises them an easy outcome, but because it shows them what it looks like to fight correctly, with patience and documentation and the quiet certainty that the process, when you use it right, is on your side. That is the only kind of fight worth having.